debate. More than 100 countries now recognise the newly formed Syrian coalition as the sole representative of the Syrian people. The decision opens the way for greater assistance to the forces fighting the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which has been criticised for not being organised enough and certainly not representative enough. Let's hear what the French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius had to say at today's Friends of Syria summit in Marrakech.
The first thing we can and must do is to recognize the coalition. We have done it as a group, but each of our countries must do so individually, if it's not already the case. We must support by all means, whether humanitarian or financial, the coalition's efforts towards the Syrian people, and to do so as often as possible through the coalition.
But as that diplomatic activity ramps up, the situation with Syrian refugees worsens by the hour. More than 500,000 refugees are now seeking international aid. And the numbers are climbing by more than 3,000 a day. In fact, the figure is probably much larger, with agencies estimating at least another 300,000 people who have yet to register as refugees. The situation is even more dire inside Syria itself, where at least 2 million others reportedly have been displaced. And all of this as the region is now facing winter. So, given this flurry of diplomatic activity, are we indeed any closer to organising a humanitarian corridor? Joining me to talk about this is Gilbert Baudrier from the organisation Doctors of the World, Louis Perard from the European Union Institute for Security Studies. We're hoping later to talk to Majid Rafizadeh, a Syrian political expert who's based in Los Angeles. We do have with us Jerry Simpson from Human Rights Watch from Geneva. And later on, we'll be speaking to Andrew Harper, the UNHCR representative to Jordan. I'd like to say thanks to all of you for joining me. And first of all, Gilbert, let's talk about the conditions those refugees are facing. The situation's not going to get any better, certainly given that we've now got colder weather in that part of the world.
Yes, exactly. We work on 3 countries with refugees. One in the Zaatari camp in Jordan, one at the border of Syria, inside Syria at the camp of Ka, where there is 3,500 refugees in a small camp with tent and in bad condition, because actually there is a lot of rain and mud, but we try to face to this condition by water sanitation, and also we have made a primary healthcare facilitation. And also in Bekaa Plateau in Lebanon, we work with a partnership with a Lebanon association called Hamel, and this is mainly we see a lot of respiratory disease, diarrhea, and also skin disease.
And I imagine the stress too, because they've all, experiencing fairly traumatic situations.
We also have mental health care in Jordan, especially with a network of Jordan and Syrian network of psychological and psychiatrists.
Can you just tell me a little bit more about the sort of daily life in those camps at the moment?
First of all, they are pretty well organized, because there is a lot of solidarity between host people and the refugees. This is especially internal déplacés inside Syria. And also in the part where we worked at the beginning in Jordan, which was at the south of the border and the city of Ramta, where there is a lot of neighborhood and people who have their families inside Jordan. And so there is a lot of solidarity inside the city of Ramta.
I'd like to bring in now Majid Rafizadeh, a Syrian political expert who's joining us from Los Angeles. Majid, we've been talking about those refugees outside the country, but of course inside the country, apparently there's somewhere an estimated 2 million people who are now displaced. And they're certainly facing a horrific situation given food shortages, power disruptions, not to mention the bloody fighting that's going on. I assume, it's the situation inside Syria is 1,000 times worse.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is a very important question because there have been more focus on the exterior cases of the Syrian refugees who have fled their countries. But there is been less attention being paid on the people who are displaced inside the country. And as you mentioned, there is an estimate of 1/5 of the Syrian population. And there have been reports that the regime actually Assad regime using a systematic campaign in order to shell the cities and displace the people inside Syria, so that the rebels and the revolutionaries will have to focus on the emergency relief and providing shelters for these people rather than targeting the regime. But on the humanitarian and aid, I think, crisis, we are approaching, as you mentioned, the urgent mode of winterization in Syria. And the winter in Syria is very bitter and very bone-chilling, especially in the steppe areas of the desert near the borders. And if these urgent basic needs is not provided for these people, many of these people might not survive even the winter, especially when more than 50% of the population, we should know that they are less than 18 years old. And these children are in real needs for basic needs like just water, blankets, in order to survive the winter.
Majid, at this point, I just want to bring in Andrew Harper, who's the UNHCR representative in Jordan. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us. Can you just give us a sort of brief description of what the situation is like there in Jordan?
Well, the situation's obviously pretty challenging. There's probably about 250,000 Syrians who we've got in the country at the moment. We've got a number of camps which have been set up. We've got about 500 people who are coming across every night, and the range from almost every segment of what you would imagine from Syrian society. We have newborns coming across. With the oldest person we've had come across is 99 years. We're getting people who have been injured from recent fighting. We're getting pregnant women. It's an extremely daunting situation when we're looking across the border into Syria. We're seeing artillery being fired at villages, and every night we're seeing hundreds of people crossing. But we also know there's tens of thousands of people who would like to cross if they get given the opportunity. So we're gearing up on a whole range of fronts to not only deal with the population that we've got in place at the moment, but also be prepared for the continuing influx as the situation deteriorates during the winter in Syria.
And Jerry Simpson from Human Rights Watch, who's joining us from Geneva. Jerry, you guys have been keeping a sort of close eye on the movement of refugees. What sort of issues have come up? As I understand there's been a problem, for instance, with border crossings.
Well, it has to be said that in the main, all countries in the region have done a good job in keeping their borders open and letting the vast majority of people cross. We've documented problems a few months ago where Jordan was creating difficulties for Palestinians entering in relatively small numbers. We know that deterred the Palestinians from even trying to get to Jordan. We've also documented partial border closures by
I'm sorry,
and by Iraq, which started in mid to late August and which are ongoing. In fact, just today, the UN country team in Turkey issued a document that confirmed 25,000 Syrians are stuck on the Syrian side of the Turkish border in places that we visited in October, and where we documented 10,000 people stuck in October. The Turks have said that there are difficulties with capacity in the refugee camps they have set up, but that obviously doesn't give them an excuse from preventing people to flee to wherever they can seek sanctuary. And we have repeatedly called on Turkey and Iraq to reopen their partially closed borders, which, as I say, remain closed as of today.
Lewis Perel, we've just had a sort of a wrap-up there of the situation facing these neighbouring countries, and it seems like today the focus has been very much on strengthening the coalition and boosting the rebel forces on the ground. But as a result, dealing with this enormous humanitarian crisis seems to have slipped to priority number 3.
This is true, and I will provide just one figure. As was stated in early reports this month by the United Nations, only 35% of the money requested had been offered by member states in order to cover the humanitarian needs of these people, which may entail great problems in the short term when they need to compete with local populations. So it's clear that the international community is failing the Syrian people and specifically Syrian refugees in not being able to cover their needs properly.
Gilbert Potier, would you agree with that?
Yes, it is a big problem because at the beginning we were not in Syria and also we were near Turkey, and there is a problem with donors who can give us some grants to go inside the country where we are not allowed. So we were undercover, and it was a little bit difficult to be to send some help and to try to implement some program inside Syria at the beginning.
Majid Ravizadeh, I would imagine you would agree with this point too, that the international community has failed to deal with this worsening humanitarian crisis. What sort of ramifications is this going to have in the long term?
Well, I think this is an important question. I think the reason the international community has failed, I think there has been a lot of focus on the political and diplomatic issues of this crisis, whether Assad should be in power or whether he should relinquish power. And there has been the division and stalemate on domestic and regional and international level. Domestic between the rebels and the regime, and regional is between Iran and the Cold War between Iran and other groups, and also on international level between Russia and United States, France, and Britain. And I think if the current trends continues, the regional countries are more likely to put the limits for the refugees, as Turkey has already, the Prime Minister of Turkey, Erdogan, said that he raised concern that the Security Council members are not dealing with this conflict well, and they will put a limit for refugees. You know, many of these countries, Iraq, Jordan, and the regional countries, they already had experiences with Palestinian and Iraqi refugees. So there would be a limit, and the difficulties are how we can later return these people to their houses, and how can we rebuild their homes.
Andrew Harper, you're on the ground in Amman, and I imagine you're seeing a flood of refugees come across that border every day. Does it worry you that the international community doesn't seem to be making this an important priority?
Well, it certainly does, because I think countries like Jordan are basically taken for granted that because they've got such a fantastic history of providing refuge to people in distress, and again, your previous commentator was talking about the Palestinians and the Iraqis. But we've got 250,000 Syrians who are here out of a population of about 6 to 7 million people. And we've got hundreds of thousands of people who'd want to come across. And we're still underfunded. We're still struggling to try and provide enough blankets, enough heaters, enough tents for the population who are here. And we're looking across the border and we're seeing tens of thousands of people who are trying to get across, and the international community is just talking. And there's got to be a point when we realise, as far as the international community is concerned, that it pays to actually invest in preparedness, particularly when we can see that the situation in Syria is deteriorating. There's been very little progress on the political front, and it's the humanitarian agencies and states who are surrounding the country who have to pick up the pieces. We know there's a humanitarian crisis going on at the moment. Let's not make it a humanitarian disaster.
Jerry Simpson, one of the problems, of course, is getting access into Syria. And you, as part of an aid organisation that's been watching very closely what's happening in that part of the country, you can understand the difficulties associated with aid groups accessing the country. Is it time for a humanitarian corridor to be established?
That's not something that we've taken a position on, so I'm afraid that's not something I can comment on. But there's no question that the IDP crisis inside Syria is absolutely appalling, and that there is a massive gap in knowledge of what's going on. You know, we see plenty of reports on where very brave, in many cases, aid agencies put their lives and well-being at risk to document what they can. But there is clearly a gap in information, and only a very small percentage of the estimated 2 million displaced people are getting anywhere near the kind of help they need. So, but whether or not a humanitarian corridor is appropriate, I'm afraid that's not something I can comment on.
Luis Perel, I imagine when we talk about a humanitarian corridor, that is something that needs to be done, in your opinion, and it needs to be done quickly.
In fact, we are 18 months late, and it becomes more and more difficult as time goes by, since now it will be a clear signal that the international community is in war with the regime, whereas I believe that at the beginning of the conflict it would have been a lot easier, and it would have perhaps prevented the situation that we are facing now.
So it's too late?
It's never too late. I would say that it will entail a lot more difficulties now, and of course it has entailed a lot more suffering for these nearly 2 years of conflict.
Gilbert Potier, what steps need to be taken in order to establish a humanitarian aid corridor?
What steps? It's difficult to give an answer to that. What we did actually, we make a network with Syrian doctors to send a lot of drugs and medicine and some non-item foods to be helpful in the cities we were all day long bombed by the army, especially because they target the hospital in this city. And also we have an emergency preparedness to go inside the Syria as soon as possible. But actually, as it was saying, it was a little bit later because we have done this emergency preparedness 9 months before and we didn't use it. And so we are trying to send some medicine and some drugs actually inside Syria because there is no real events to have this emergency preparedness inside Lebanon, Syria and Turkey because it's not helpful.
Luis, what steps need to be taken in order to establish a corridor?
This is of course very difficult, but in order to get a political settlement in Syria, which is now being requested by the international community, international negotiators need some leverage. And that means at some point the threat to use force in Syria, of course, in my view, should have been always limited to the creation of protected area in order to protect Syrian people. And that would have helped the negotiation process.
Luis, I'm afraid we just have to press the pause button at this stage, because we need to take a short break, and we're going to be back very shortly with the second part of the debate. Do stay with us here on France 24.